Let's begin with the global financial crisis of 2008. The US economy collapsed because they had a financial crisis, because they had built up too much debt in the housing market in the US. That particular crash should have sent a signal to the whole world. And what's that signal? It is that you cannot really depend on financial markets to give you, shall we say, reasoned outcomes. So how did the global economy recover from that crash? It didn't. But in India, our recovery has been rather unusual. We got a recovery in GDP, but we didn't get a recovery in employment. How did the advanced economies recover? What happened to the rich world? They recovered basically by what you would call blood transfusions. In our country, it wasn't the government that took on debt, but we had private players who took on a lot of debt. The big feature about the pandemic, the most defining feature to me, is not how sudden it was or how fatal it was or how terrible it was, but just how unequal it showed the world to be. So just to give you one indicator, the US between January 2020 and March 2021 spent almost $30,000 per person. Additional government spending, but also the extremely rich individuals also got very rich. How could that happen when the whole world is in a crisis, when economies are downsliding? Well, the one big thing that happened because of the Ukraine war that affected the rest of the world was the massive increase in gas and food prices.
It is with immense pleasure that we welcome our speaker, Professor Jayati Ghosh, to our third TNtalk. A brief about our chief guest. Professor Jayati Ghosh is a development economist by profession. She is a professor in Department of Economics, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and has been appointed as a member of UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism since March 2022. She has also been the chairperson of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for about 35 years. Her core areas of study including international economics, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policies, and issues related to gender and development. She has authored and edited 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles and has received several awards, including Adis Asia Award 2015 for distinguished contributions to social sciences in India, and the International Labour Organization Decent Work Prize for 2011. She was Executive Secretary of International Development Economics Associates, an international network of heterodox development economists from 2002 to 2021. She has consulted for international organizations including ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD, UNDESA, UNRISD, and UN Women, and is member of several international boards and commissions, including the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, the Commission on Global Economic Transformation of INET, and ICRICT. In 2021, she was appointed to the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, chaired by Mariana Mazzucato. Ma'am, thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitations. We are honored by your presence here and are eager to listen to your thoughts and perspectives on the global economy. With this short introduction, we can welcome with great applause.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful library. I have to say I'm really jealous of all of you in Chennai for having this wonderful space. And yes. I wish I could actually see you all. It's, the lighting is such that I don't get to see you, but I know that you are all, well, like me, you have appreciated this space, and of course you also get to use it in every day, which is wonderful. So I'm going to talk about the global economy, and later on perhaps we can talk a little bit about how it impacts on India and what it really means for us all of the turbulence that we can see around us. So let's think about this global economy a little bit from the past, not very much of the past. Let's begin with the global financial crisis of 2008. So I'm sure all of you, well, some of you anyway, will remember that in a lot of detail. What we do know is that the US economy collapsed because they had a financial crisis, because they had built up too much debt in the housing market in the US. And that crash, which should have been confined to the US economy, ended up being transmitted to the entire world. And the weird thing is that when the US economy crashed, in fact, capital flew back to the US. You would think that the country in crisis is the one that is going to face capital flight out of it, but no. Everywhere else in the world, credit markets collapsed. Everywhere else in the world, money goes back to the US. Now, why would that happen? Because it's an uncertainty. You don't know what's going on. You know that markets have crashed in the US. You don't know where the markets will crash next. So immediately you think of the safest possible asset you can hold. And this is true for central banks. This is true for very rich people. This is true for big corporations. This is true for financial companies and banks. They said, what's the safest asset in the world? It's US Treasury bills. It's US securities. So they all went back to the US. Now, that particular crash in September 2008, it's known as the moment, the Lehman Brothers moment. You remember there was a particular bank that collapsed, which was relatively small. That particular crash should have sent a signal to the whole world. And what's that signal? It is that you cannot really depend on financial markets to give you, shall we say, reasoned outcomes. Yeah? You can't expect that capital flight will follow norms that make sense, that are rational and sensible. Instead, what is likely to happen is that when there's a panic, people will go back to wherever they think is most powerful, and therefore that will be more stable. So the message it should have sent to the rest of the world is, don't rely so much on international financial markets. Don't think that the more you integrate financially, the safer you will be, because actually you'll be more unstable and more unsafe. That should have been the message. Is that the message we got? No, we didn't. We actually decided that we would continue with what had happened before. Now, when that crash occurred, there was, as I said, a global recession. What is a recession? Well, the economists in the advanced economies describe a recession as something where the economy slows down. It reduces in size for 2 quarters. There's less economic activity for 2 quarters in a row. That's called a recession. But in fact, economists say that, well, you can have more generalized recessions. You can have a situation where the rate of growth comes down, where employment is falling, and that can be combined with many other things. You can even have rising prices in a period of recession. You can have output falling, but some people getting richer, as we know now, in a period of recession. So all of these are things that we have discovered about recessions since that major global crash. So how did the global economy recover from that crash? It didn't. If I tell you honestly, it didn't actually recover in the full sense. In other words, if we look at output, global economic activity, in the period since 2009, the rate of growth of economic activity has come down to about half of what it was in the period before, the period that led up to the crash. And particularly, some economies have recovered much less than others. Now, in fact, China, India, we were supposed to be the ones that recovered the fastest. And China definitely recovered the fastest. But in India, our recovery has been rather unusual. We got a recovery in GDP, but we didn't get a recovery in employment. In fact, all the data we have suggest that our absolute employment numbers have fallen between 2011-12 and 2017-18. In other words, that last decade, when we were supposedly growing well, was a period when we were not creating more jobs. We had less paid jobs than we had before. So a different kind of recovery. But how did the advanced economies recover? What happened to the rich world? They recovered basically by what you would call blood transfusions. Yeah? The patient was injected with all this liquidity. What is liquidity? It's a lot more money in the system. So the US Central Bank, it's called the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, they started pushing money into banks. They allowed the banks to increase their holdings of assets massively, which meant that they could lend more. That was the idea, that you're going to infuse money into these banks and allow them to lend more and therefore revive economic activity. Since this period started, every year the US Federal Reserve was pushing $2 trillion, $3 trillion, $4 trillion into the system every year. Every month it would be at least 100 trillion, sometimes 150 trillion, 250 trillion, depending on the need, would be inserted into the banks and the financial companies. And that's really how the system kept afloat. Now, what do banks do when they have all this money? They lend out to others, right? And so you got a massive increase in debt of every category, of workers, of households, of companies. Everybody's debt increased. And in the rich countries, it was also student debt, it was debt to buy things, consumer credit, it was education debt, it was health debt, it was debt to buy houses. Companies took on debt to go and invest elsewhere in the world. Basically, you got a massive explosion of debt. And this is true also in the developing world. So when you get financial companies who've been given huge amounts of money at very low interest rates, yeah, the interest rates came down to 0.06% was the interest rate in the US at a time, which really means negative if you account for price rise, right? So you're really paying nothing for all of this money. So you have all this money sloshing around the globe, looking for places to invest. And suddenly, therefore, developing countries who had been receiving some money but not that much became very attractive. They're called emerging markets, yes? What's an emerging market? A developing country that has integrated with global finance. And emerging is a polite way of saying, we like you now. Now we're going to give you money. And so you have much more money flowing into emerging markets. And you even have what are called frontier markets, okay, which were markets that nobody would look at before because they were seen as too risky. So in sub-Saharan Africa, conflict-ridden countries in Asia, countries that never could get access to global finance suddenly also became attractive. They were frontier markets. So all this money sloshing around the globe, creating debt, which should be all fine, except that when you need just a little bit of a change in expectations for this money to go rushing back. Okay? Remember, we saw this with the global financial crisis. It was a crisis in the US, yet because it changes people's expectations, money goes back to the US. That's exactly what happened again during the pandemic. Okay? You get a major global crisis that hadn't been, well, I won't say that no one expected it, but nobody expected it exactly then at that time, shall we say. So you got a massive health crisis that was spreading across the globe. And for a change, it also was a health crisis that affected the rich countries. Okay? And as a result, you got the financial markets in panic. Once again, you had a massive outflow suddenly in March 2020. Then they said, okay, maybe they're all right, they're back to inflow in April. Then again another outflow in September, then maybe an inflow in December. They went crazy. They were very uncertain and worried. But meanwhile, all these countries, these emerging markets, frontier markets, had taken on debt because it was so cheap. In our country, it wasn't the government that took on debt, but we had private players who took on a lot of debt. We know their names, we know what's going on with some of them. So there's always a problem when you take on too much debt. But many developing countries found that suddenly they couldn't access the same debt. And suddenly, therefore, you have a problem because you have to repay a lot of money in debt service, in interest payments and things like that. And then you're not able to get foreign exchange. Because the pandemic period, exports came down, services like tourism, things that gave you foreign exchange before, that money is coming down. A lot of countries got less remittances, so that money is coming down. So how do you actually manage? How do you repay? many countries started experiencing debt crises. Now, the pandemic went on for at least 1.5 years, as we know, in terms of restricting economic activity. And when you're restricting economic activity, your GDP is not growing. That makes it even harder for you to deal with all of these external problems. But the big feature about the pandemic, the most defining feature to me, is not how sudden it was or how fatal it was or how terrible it was, but just how unequal it showed the world to be. So the rich countries, first of all, they grabbed the vaccines and then they prevented production of these vaccines elsewhere in the world, were able to actually appropriate 85% of all vaccine production in 2021. And everybody else had to struggle with whatever they could make, which is why even in India, our vaccine program started later than it should have, which is why we had such a terrible second wave, the Delta wave, as you know. But in addition to the vaccine grabbing and the unequal access to vaccines, the biggest and most reprehensible sign of inequality was the fiscal response, by which I mean how much government spending changed as a result of the pandemic. So we had a massive difference in how the advanced economies responded and how emerging markets and low-income countries responded, okay? So the rich countries decided that now we can spend. This is after decades of saying, no, governments can't spend more, we can't have fiscal deficits, it's very unsafe. What we can do is increase money supply. This is what they've been saying, right, for a decade. Suddenly you discover you can spend. And they spent like anything. Between 10% to 30% of GDP they spent. So just to give you one indicator, the US, between January 2020 and March 2021, spent almost $30,000 per person. Additional government spending, additional. That's the kind of increase that we saw in the US public spending to counter the pandemic. By contrast, developing countries didn't dare spend that much, partly because we were worried about capital flight. You know, you have a large fiscal deficit, and then the rating agency says, no, that's very bad, we have to downgrade you, and then there will be capital flight. So the middle-income countries spent between 4 and 6% of GDP, not between 10 and 30%, much less. The low-income countries couldn't spend because anyway they had debt problems, anyway they had lost exports, anyway they couldn't afford to import more. So they spent between 2 and 4% of GDP only. So what does that mean in comparative terms? I told you the US was spending $30,000 per person more in that period. The low-income countries spent $2 more per person. $2 over that entire period, additional. So that tells you what the difference was. Now, what does it mean? It means obviously there will be much later economic recovery in these countries. It means there will be longer time before employment comes back, longer time before you can even do the health spending that you feel is so necessary in a pandemic, yeah? Many countries continue to spend more on repaying debt than they could spend on health and all of the basic things you need to do to deal with in a pandemic. So it's a very unequal world, okay, post-pandemic, and it's got more unequal. Within that inequality, of course, there is the inside country inequality, which has got even worse, because we know in each country the very rich got even richer and most of the rest of the population got poorer. Okay, so that was the other feature. Some companies, digital companies especially, benefited hugely, okay, because everybody started doing everything digitally, right? Whether it's e-commerce or you're doing all your entertainment through Netflix or whatever, all the activity moved to that area. So the digital companies got very rich, but also the extremely rich individuals also got very rich. How could that happen when the whole world is in a crisis, when economies are downsliding? Because finance continued to demand its pound of flesh from everyone and continued to get it, okay? So the financial elite, the very, very rich individuals who control global finance, they continued to get their money. The very rich entrepreneurs, the Elon Musks and Bill Gates and others, continued to remain very rich and get richer. Our own extremely rich, our two Mr. A's and others also continued to get very rich and even richer. Of course, the biggest increase in wealth was the one who has come down most recently. Mr. Adani, Gautam Adani's wealth increased 100-fold over this period. It's coming down to more realistic levels now. But the basic tendency was massive inequality. Now, this is a context in which you get the Ukraine war. So yes, Russia should never have invaded Ukraine. It's a terrible act of aggression. But the US response was to say, we are going to impose sanctions, and we are going to insist that we can just freeze the assets of any country who does things that we don't like. So there were trade sanctions, and there was the freezing of assets, like Russian central bank assets in the United States, and the assets of some Russian oligarchs who were close to Mr. Putin. How did that change everything? Well, the one big thing that happened because of the Ukraine war that affected the rest of the world was the massive increase in gas and food prices. And everyone said, oh, it's because of the Ukraine war. Yeah? Russia is a major fuel exporter. It's a big oil and natural gas exporter. And Russia and Ukraine together produce a lot of wheat, and they export wheat. And Russia is a big exporter of fertilizer. So obviously, all of these prices will go up. That's what everyone said. Well, it turns out that that wasn't the real reason. We're all told that prices rose because of the Ukraine war. But now we know prices didn't rise because of the Ukraine war. Prices rose because there was profiteering by the big companies who sell these things. And there was financial speculation in global commodity markets that made the price rise even faster and faster. And now this is well documented. We know that the big beneficiaries of this were petroleum companies and the big agribusinesses who control wheat prices, okay? Not related to the war, because the supply, the global supply of oil and wheat didn't change. Very different from what you read in the newspapers, right? In the newspapers, we kept hearing, oh my God, the supply is going to be affected because of the war. It turns out, no. The supply remained the same. Prices shot up. Prices went up, bam, like that, okay, between January and July, and they came down again, so that by November, they were back to the levels of the pre-war. Nothing had changed in global supply. This was entirely driven by companies raking it in, getting excess profits, on the back of everybody believing that prices have to go up because supply has changed, okay? Now, this is fine. It's bad news for the rest of the world and for people who have to pay more for food and fuel. But it would be fine if you could then say, well, this is inflation that is driven by these price increases in basic goods, right? Fuel enters everything, production and distribution of everything. So if the price of fuel goes up, all other prices will go up. And food is a basic need. Food, wheat prices, basic food, everybody is going to need it. So if those prices go up, obviously other prices will go up, right? That's why you got inflation. That's why you got higher prices in the advanced economies and in other countries. And then, of course, there were these supply constraints because of COVID. Because China had still been closed, a lot of the things China used to produce, it weren't so easily available, so those prices also went up. But that's really all. These were all supply issues. So, in fact, if the policy had recognized that these are supply issues and firms making excess profits, then the policy should have been to say, well, all right, we stop them making the excess profits. We tax away all these super profits that they have made by profiting off people's tragedies, okay? And we do something about the supply bottlenecks. That should have been the policy response. Instead, what is the policy response of the advanced economies? Oh, inflation is up, so we have to raise interest rates. And we have to tighten money supply. Now, why is that? That's because of a very old and a very false belief that inflation is always the result of too much money supply. Okay? Now, that's simply not true. It was never true, but it is even less true today. Okay? Inflation, when you think about excess money supply, didn't I tell you that there was this massive increase in money supply after 2009? Between 2010 and 2020, global injections of money, especially by the advanced economy banks, was in the excess of $32 trillion. $32 trillion was the amount of money flooding the system. Did it give you increased prices? No. Okay? Because demand was still low. It didn't act, all it did was give you this money moving around the globe, trying to generate more profits and getting more and more countries indebted and more sectors indebted. But once the prices started rising, and they were rising for supply reasons, right? Not for demand reasons. What's the response of the central banks? Oh, prices are going up, we will have to raise interest rates to cut down on demand. Because demand is too high. That's why the prices are going up. And so that's what has happened. We've had the biggest increase in interest rates in the US and in the ECB in a short period. That is to say, there have been big interest rate increases before, but this has been very rapid. You know, every month, bam, 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 bam. So much more, so much more, so much more. So suddenly, it's getting more and more expensive to borrow. And for the rest of the world, US has become a more attractive place to keep your money. So here are all these developing countries who had taken on debt when interest rates were low and when they were almost begged to take on the debt. Yes? And now you have all these multiple whammies. You have the pandemic, you have the impact of the Ukraine war in terms of the rising prices of food and fuel, which were because of profiteering and because of commodity speculation. Okay? And now you have the US raising interest rates and Europe raising interest rates. So all of the global capital wants to go back to these safe havens. And that means that once again, there's capital outflow from these countries. Even a country like India, which until recently was seen as the big, great hope, our net capital flows are in the period until just last month, before the Adani fiasco, were negative. We were losing capital. Why? Because always the US is the preferred home of all of this. So now that capital is going back to the US, what's the purpose of this monetary policy? They say it explicitly. The purpose is to cause output to come down, economic activity to slow down, unemployment to increase. Why? Because you want wages to come down. The only way to bring wages down is to make unemployment increase. Why do you want wages to come down? Because wages are causing inflation. But wages are not causing inflation, you say. It's profits that are causing inflation. No, never mind. We have to bring wages down if we want to bring down inflation. So in the US and in Europe, what is happening? This is, in a sense, it's kind of class war in these areas, okay? It's class war. It is basically saying you spent too much during the pandemic and workers got a better deal, and that's no good. We can't allow that. So we have to actually now bring out a situation where you generate a recession, you instigate a recession to cause workers to get less money, because that's how we're going to bring down inflation. Now, they probably know it's not about bringing down inflation. They probably know that it's about this class war in a way. But the interesting thing is that while they might be worried about the domestic response, they're not looking at all about what this has in terms of the impact on the rest of the world. So they are announcing that yes, we are going to raise our interest rates. And in fact, President Biden even said it. We know that this will have a bad effect on other countries, but we can't help it. We have to do what we have to do. Really? You're raising interest rates to harm your own workers, but you are also harming the rest of the world massively. So now here's the funny thing. What's the likely outcome of this? Because the US has spent so much already, and because it's continuing to spend more, the public spending is still very high, it probably won't have a recession. It probably will continue on a reasonable rate without major unemployment increases, especially as now they are beginning to taper off the interest rate increases. But the rest of the world, we are the ones who are going to get the recession, okay? We are the ones who are going to end up with global trade slowing. All the predictions are that global trade will grow at maybe half the rate it grew before in the previous year, with investments not coming to us, going instead back to the US and maybe Europe, and with all of the other safety nets that we had disappearing, okay? That's the rest of the world, broadly speaking, not just India. Especially those countries that already had debt problems. So I already told you, right, that many countries in the world got into big debt problems because of the pandemic, who were chugging along nicely. They had taken on lots of debt, maybe too much debt, but they were planning on repaying according to their schedule. But then the pandemic comes, then you don't have export earnings, you don't get remittances from workers abroad, you don't get tourism revenues, so you can't have the foreign exchange to actually pay some of your debt. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates that 58 countries are currently in severe debt distress. About 6 countries have already defaulted. Okay, Sri Lanka, as we know, our neighbor, has defaulted. Ghana has defaulted. A bunch of other countries have defaulted. Morocco has defaulted. So there are already countries that have defaulted. But there are another 20 or 25 countries who are just teetering on the edge. Not yet in severe distress, but likely to be in severe distress. You would think that anyone could have seen this coming, that you have a large lot of debt, you are creating a situation where people don't earn foreign exchange, they don't earn dollars, they're going to find it difficult to repay. So you'll have to reduce that debt. That should have been the response. And to be fair, they recognized that that has to be the response. So they created a fund. First, they did just a postponement of the debt. They said, okay, don't pay for the next year any of the payments. But then at the end of that year, you still have to pay, right? So then they said, all right, we will set up a process whereby we will try and reduce your debt. So they created a system. It's called the Common Framework. The Common Framework, which the G20 countries created, where the public creditors, bilateral, the international financial institutions, and the private creditors will all come together and agree to reduce the debt. Good idea, right? Sounds like finally they realized that this is a problem. Well, turns out that this common framework was started 2 years ago. Till today, not a single country has benefited. So one country that applied was Chad. It had to wait. It kept waiting. Then when oil prices went up, they were told, oh, now you don't need it. So you don't have to get the common framework. Then when the, oh, I should stop now. Yes, but let me just finish this point. Then when the another country tried to approach them, they're too busy arguing among themselves. Who's going to take a cut? You have to take a bigger haircut than I will. The World Bank and the IMF are saying, we won't take any debt reduction, you guys do the debt reduction. Countries like Sri Lanka, which is in a deep distress at the moment, they're still arguing about who is going to actually cut the debt. These are the same institutions that encourage Sri Lanka to take on all these foreign loans, international sovereign bonds with private creditors from all over. And when they are hitting a problem, they're saying, no, too bad. We will think about it, but we won't reduce our debt. Let somebody else reduce it. What does it mean? It frankly means that we are in a bit of a global mess. And it also means that it's really the rest of the world that is facing a recession. So are we facing a global recession? If you count a large part of humanity, yes. Are we facing a global recession in terms of the major economies of the world? Probably not. But will the fact that a large part of humanity is impacted by recession, hunger, unemployment, economic distress, will that come back to hit the advanced countries? Yes, it will. So I guess the real point is, will the advanced countries learn from this and actually do something to solve the problem? I don't think so. Until then, all of us will have to be looking after ourselves. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sure there will be questions.
The value of rupees in Pakistan had depreciated a lot. That makes $1 is equal to more than 200 Pakistani rupees. So what is the reason behind that? After that Russian-Ukraine war, I can see that some countries prefer rupees for international transactions. So what benefits does it make to our country?
Do you think that in the future the interest rate will go to double digit? Thinking that China and India are going away from dollar trade.
What I heard from you and whatever we have read and all of these theories that we read, they only help us to explain the general symptoms of what is actually happening. But at the root of it, they just seem like it's like people just want more power and money. So what is the role of economics in all of this?
Today is an era of AI. How will the AI will have an impact on employment?
Do you think in present time it is possible to go back to financial deglobalization?
So how can we generate a society which is economically optimistic as well as economically understanding from a very young age?